King Edward, Part 12. The dragon had paused, so Edward interjected. Mother and I have been discussing the nature of the gods recently, Akatosh, and she thinks that poetry would be a godly activity. What do you think about that notion? I am not so certain that one can attribute anything to the gods, Edward. They are another example of an unbounded problem, of course, but also their characteristics are just not very well known to us. But surely one can determine things about any being that is a god. Akatosh replied, I do not think that we can at present. They are not like the Daedra, who have a nature that is with them at their birth. That is, the Daedra capabilities are inherent in them, and not are the result of any changes have occurred to them. Willow interrupted. Akatosh, we could determine that the gods have a few basic characteristics, can't we? Edward added, Of course, Akatosh. They are powerful beings who could perform acts that are incomprehensible to us. That in itself must signify their difference. Akatosh nodded and replied, I understand your point of view, but to a farming community on Tamriel, in our southern lands, that could also describe how they would perceive me. Perhaps this is attributable to the fact that they seldom see a dragon nowadays, but it also does not mean that I am a god. Neither does it mean that I am not a god. Willow giggled and said, Of course you're not a god, Akatosh, and Edward, smiling, nodded agreement. Akatosh replied, How do you know, Willow? I can understand that you would guess that I am not a god, particularly since I am a dragon. He grinned, and then continued, But how can you know that I am not a god? Edward scoffingly replied, Well, I know that I'm not a god anyway, and I've certainly never seen you perform any godly acts, Akatosh. You also don't seem to have any worshippers about either. The companions were smiling and generally agreeing with this, but Akatosh responded, But that does not mean I have no worshippers, nor does it mean that I cannot perform any godly acts. It just means that you have not seen either of these. I am not yet certain that gods and goddesses require worshippers to maintain their existence, and as I said, I can perform magic that would look like godly acts to many Tamrielians. But the gods must have worshippers, Akatosh, said Aliera. That's how they get their sustenance, or whatever it is that allows them to continue, to be godly. Husband, you must know more about this subject. After all, you made a god of your brother XII. I did no such thing, Morlun responded, with a touch of indignation. His godhood is between him and his worshippers, among whom I am numbered. I did establish a temple cult in his memory. Anyone with the worldly means could do as much for anyone, living or dead. That alone is not enough. Maybe it helps facilitate matters, but I think it's not really necessary. I know no more of it. But if you want my opinion... He paused politely for confirmation that it was indeed still solicited, as elven etiquette demanded if one were giving an opinion at length. He continued, There must be something, godly in the person's soul or essence, or whatever part it is that does not die with the body. I know not whether that capacity is innate in the person, from birth, or conception, or quickening, whenever it is that the soul and body are wedded for lifespan, or whether great deeds and great generosity might breed it, enlarging the soul and transmuting it, so to speak. We all change and grow with each passing day, with every breath, some more than others. What else is life about? He went on without pausing for an answer to his rhetorical question, probably for fear that he might get one. In other cases, gods seem to arise from a locality, a mountain, or a spring, or wood, or a collection of localities such as Tamriel itself. Places like persons have souls, some greater than others. This place might produce a god or a Daedra, or maybe it already has one or more. As it changes, so do its gods and Daedra, I think. Maybe they can choose to resist the change or aid it, if propitiated. He looked at Akatosh inquiringly. The dragon had stopped fighting the new gods, he said. But would he go so far as to worship them? That speaks to the question of whence gods arise, but source is not nature. Of that I know as little as the rest of you, maybe less, since the question does not truly interest me. The gods are... My worship of them benefits me and mine. It is sufficient. Akatosh did not respond immediately, and Aliera refused to be distracted. But suppose such a cult were established and worshippers provided, for one of small and mean spirit, would that spirit not become a god? I suppose it might be done, if one were determined enough and had a sufficiency of means to pay the worshippers to perform rituals without spirit behind them. Maybe that's where small, mean gods come from, wife. Or maybe Daedra. Maybe I'll raise a cult to thee and see what happens." "Are you calling my spirit small and mean?" Ali glared at him. "Only by comparison. You don't fancy yourself a goddess, do you? You might make a Daedra, though. The experiment might be a bit too chancy. Could I just mourn for you a century or two instead?" I'll think on it. What about you? You've deeds enough already to qualify for godhood, surely. Although if you plan on many more such, you may not outlive me." "I'm doomed to be Rathim, living and dead. It's godhood of a sort, but what a sort. Don't begrudge me my long lifespan. Think of me doomed to an eternity in the gloomy Ebonheart council chamber listening to the eternal wrangles. Small wonder the dead Rathim pulled the place down on the live ones 20 years ago, thus causing my brother and my mother to join their number. The dead Rathim must have welcomed a century and a half of respite while the Nords held Ebonheart." "But your brother, XII, was killed too, as well as your brother King Kurethis. And XII wasn't Rathim, being your mother's son and not your father's. If I have the story straight, that's why he got his own temple," Edward said. "So why did they kill him too? The story sounds very Daedric to me." "You'd have me justify the ways of the gods to you, would you? I think they act for ends we cannot see, and slay the just and the unjust together. Not that I'd label any of my kin as either, not altogether. We see only the means, but how can we judge? Gods, too, face choices. I do not think their power supreme. They can overrule nature on occasion, just as can any mage. Yet they, like mages, are in the end bound by it, and their overrule must answer others' rules still. And in those rules, whatever they may be, I think lies the answer to your questions. I think it's not something men and women may know while living." Akatosh smiled and replied, "It is not so easy to describe the gods, is it? This is true, even though, myself included, each of us thinks that we have a mental picture of what godliness means. On the other hand, the gods and goddesses certainly do exist, and I also believe that there is a connection of some sort between them and the Daedra, and another connection between these entities and the power associated with performing magic." "The priests of Julianos have been calling this power magica," said a stranger who had joined the group. Akatosh replied, "Greetings, Bard. Please allow me to introduce Geoffrey, a wandering poet who has been visiting our village these last few days." The companions greeted the wood elf newcomer, some rising to their feet to do so according to their individual customs, then all resumed sitting, actually sprawling about, and conversing. "A number of priests are theorizing that the gods and goddesses live on another plane, as do the Daedra. There is some debate among these priests as to whether they share the same plane of existence, or whether each has their own, and some of the Alesian priests are claiming that we can visit these alternate planes in our nightly dreams," added Beach. Edward asked, "Why doesn't someone just ask a goddess or a Daedra about this?" Geoffrey chuckled and replied, "Most of us are not able to be so thoughtful when confronted by one of these beings, Edward. Also, there's a common belief that the gods and Daedra are as reluctant to discuss their own natures as dragons are to reveal anyone's true name." Edward looked quizzically at Akatosh, but Beach stated to Geoffrey, "Well said, Bard." And that pair shared the slightest of smiles. Beach then said, "Do you know what the resolutions of Zenithar has been saying about gods and magic? This magic power, or magica, is just the power generated by the existence of, existence itself. When it becomes focused by living beings through natural processes, then it becomes accessible to the gods and goddesses as worship power, which is the next level of magica. After receiving from their worshippers, the gods can then concentrate it up to god-level power, the true magica. The gods themselves can't generate the mid-level magica since they are dependent on it for their own existence, but they can convert it to magica, which can then be used by mortals to cast spells. This magica is usually dispersed widely across the planes, but there are areas of greater and lesser concentration due to interferences with the dispersion processes. When a goddess loses worshippers, her inflow of mid-level magica is decreased. So she in turn produces less god-level magicka. With less magicka under her control for providing to worshippers a dispersion, her influence is decreased in the mortal planes. Of course, the converse is also true. In the extreme, she receives nothing and is relegated to a state of stasis, barely existing from the ordinary magicka generated for her by her few remaining consecrated lands, zones of influence, and so on. Beach continued. On the other hand, Daedra receive very specific or modified mid-level magicka from a few mortals with specific areas of interest, and these Daedra are normally tied to the very specific circumstances. Because of their nature, they gain much more power from their small worship base, but the gods, with their much broader base, generally have greater overall power, even though the amount of concentrated worship that they receive from any one source is much less than a Daedra's. Most of the magicka that the gods process is dispersed into and throughout the universe, no longer under their control, thereby making it available for everyone. It's not really something they do consciously, but it's a natural process that happens automatically. In other words, just because they are divine. Aliera said, I would think that magicka is simply available to sentient beings, although the gods and Daedra could facilitate its usage. I would think that the gods and Daedra have other influences on us as well, because not everyone has spellcasting ability. Maybe in those alternate planes it's actually existence, and not sentient entities, that radiates magicka, just as the stars give off light in our dimension. Just assume that magicka is out there, in the ether, or maybe sentient consciousnesses automatically tap into an alternate plane as they sleep. I think that everyone has some supply of magicka, but most don't know how to use it very well, or else they adopt a way of life that inhibits or forbids its use. Maybe certain gods and Daedras serve as facilitators for the entire process, that is, obtaining and using magicka. But how do priests heal and cure and bless? Is magicka involved at all, or do they invoke the goddesses directly? Sa'a said, I am not sure that magicka is used. Perhaps there is yet another capability involved here. This capability would be unknown at this time, and maybe even unsensed, but I feel fairly certain that somehow it is a godly force that they are employing. Then Geoffrey responded, Sa'as, I believe that magicka fills the universe of planes. All things are infused with magicka to one extent or another. In this regard, magicka is attracted to some people and things over others, and some people with talented training can control and even release magicka in new forms. There may be other sources of magicka available by tapping into alternate and otherworldly planes. There's also the possibility of alternate planes that are entirely void of magicka. Regardless, certain beings of great power, such as gods and Daedra, can not only control magicka, but can see, absorb, and transfuse magicka to and from objects and people. By employing this ability, worshippers of these beings are sometimes capable of greater acts of magicka than they could accomplish otherwise. Also, in this way, some items are sacred to powerful beings, can be said to be holy, with additional amounts of directed magicka provided by gods or goddesses. Magic items fall into two main categories by definition. Items that draw on the surrounding magicka to create spell-like effects, and items that hold magic in reserve for their own internal effects. Normally, magic items which absorb magicka, giving increased abilities to their wielders, only affect themselves and are considered to be used as internal magicka. In some areas where great amounts of magicka have been used, the surrounding may be completely devoid of it. This, of course, negates the ability of beings to produce magic effects in these areas. Though gods and Daedra carry their own supplies of magicka, as do magic items that do not depend on the use of surrounding magicka. Aliera said, We have been investigating some rumors and stories concerning something that might be called anti-magicka. I think the presence of powerful Daedra with whom you weren't in tune could cause interference with spellcasting, maybe even cancel out existing spells. Perhaps particular Daedra simply favor thief or warrior types. Or some goddesses and their priests might frown on competing magic in certain areas, for example in locations dedicated to them, so that unauthorized spells could interfere with their rituals. Willow asked, Can Daedra supply magicka? And how about both the god and Daedra being nearby? Wouldn't they sort of nullify each other's powers? This might be the cause of the anti-magica effect. I've experienced an anti-magica zone myself, inserted Myth. I felt a lot like an effect of casting a spell like Dispel Magica. At the time, I thought that a truly powerful spellcaster could still effectively cast spells, but their resulting power would have been much reduced. I didn't get a chance to test this out, though, added Myth with a smile. We can also assume that certain powerful spells, creatures, and even magic items might actually drain the surrounding area of magica, replied Geoffrey. This could be extended to places where great amounts of magic energy were once gathered and expended. For example, in ancient temples where great spells were cast, or battlefields where powerful mages contested. Perhaps certain metals or stones could act as absorbers of magica, allowing the whole structures of anti-magica zones. If so, you might be able to wear an amulet made out of anti-magica material and gain a good advantage against spellcasters. Perhaps the purity of the material would allow for a better and better magic resistance. Akatosh spoke. Dragons have long been interested in the anti-magica effect, naturally enough. We have found some amulets that appear to act as magica absorbers. They might contain something like negative magica, in which case they would attract any stray magica floating free in the local area. They are made of a stone or metal resembling marble. It is very rare, but could be extracted and shaped by skilled craftsmen. For example, I'm sure that the dwarves could have worked with this material. They might have made these amulets, or even that statue I once saw. It was taller than any of you humanoids. Regardless, in these mountains we have found deposits scattered throughout the halls and tunnels at random, sometimes deep within the walls. Consequently, one appears to go in and out of these anti-magic zones of varying intensities, with little or no warning. I've been imagining that this material works almost automatically. It seems to reflexively absorb magica if given a chance to. However, we cannot rule out the possibility that they have been magically charged somehow. Perhaps this happened long ago, but the charge has somehow remained. Morlun asked, would the amulet affect its wearer, or would he be immune? Maybe a blocking spell would be developed, and then cast, to shield the wearer from the effects of the substance. Morlun then asked, but Akatosh, getting back from our earlier discussions, what do you think of the speculations concerning the connections between the gods and goddesses, Daedra and Magica? Akatosh replied, I think that there are many truths that we do not know, and perhaps there are some truths that we are meant not to know. Morlun asked with a smile, all right then, I've always wanted to know this. Considering the shape of your mouth and teeth, how do dragons manage to speak the humanoid languages so clearly? Akatosh paused and carefully responded, why, in much the same way that we can fly, even though our wings are not naturally strong enough to support such heavy torsos. Speaking of dragonflight and sunsets, Myth said, rising to his feet and squinting into the red gold eastern sky, we have a visitor, Dragon Lord. That's not a bird. Akatosh's head came up and he too scanned the sky. Tension grew in him, and one by one the companions rose, watching as the distant dot grew nearer and resolved itself into the largest dragon they had seen yet. Matilda, Akatosh exclaimed, she deigns to bestow her presence on us. His wings lifted and unfurled, and the companions broke and ran for cover as he took flight. The two dragons wheeled through the sky, spouting great gouts of flame against the purpling sky. They're fighting, Edward cried. What does it mean? Who is Matilda? I don't know who she is, son, Morlun replied, but they do not fight. You behold a dragon greeting ceremony. The pair lit beyond a rock outcropping out of sight. Should we go greet the stranger too? Edward asked. Nay, Myth said. They'll let us know if our presence is wanted. Look, even the other dragons stay away. It was true. Dragon heads had poked from the caverns to witness the event, but none of them had taken wing, and now they were retreating to their hordes within. The companions ambled back into the meadow together and built a fire as a chill wind had sprung up. The elves sang an evening hymn to the stars, deftly weaving the dark elf version with the wood elf form. Aliera added her voice to theirs, but Mats and Edward and Silk and Sa'a sat listening silently. They couldn't manage elven music of this kind. Geoffrey had a particularly clear, sweet voice, Edward thought. Akatosh returned presently, smiling in satisfaction. Matilda's going to join us here, at least for a while, he said. He was actually glowing in the dusk, each scale giving off a glowing radiance. Is she your queen? Edward asked, feeling very small and human. She just is. Maybe she'll want to meet you all someday. I hope so. Until then, well, I don't talk about other dragons, you know. To which Edward blinked in surprise and then surmise, and the discussion devolved into jokes and songs for the remainder of that clear and beautiful evening.